Hey Podcast Babe, welcome to season 9 of the Podcast Babes podcast. My name is Anna Klasse, host of this pod and founder of the Podcast Babes. Every week, I interview and inspire a female podcaster here who has made her podcast work for her and her business. So tune in to learn from her mistakes, create your own profitable podcast. Here's today's episode. Hey Podcast Babes, welcome to a new episode. I'm here today with Claire Pelletreau. She is your go-to Facebook and Instagram ads expert, and she's also a podcast host, of course. That's why she's on the show today. I'm really excited to have you here, Claire. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, so can you tell us a little bit more about what you do, your business as an ads expert, and yeah, kind of just what that looks like, what you do exactly at the day-to-day.
Yeah, sure. So I teach small business owners, coaches, course creators, freelancers. I teach them how to use Facebook and Instagram ads primarily to grow their audience because that's how they're going to grow their sales. But also we use some strategic ads specifically for sales as well. So I do that with two different offers. I have like a self-study course where you can just, come in, get your ads up and running. We have a group where people ask questions and we can answer their questions so that, they can just get things done quickly. And then we have another program. It's more of a coaching program where we help people not only with their ads, but also where the ads are going to, sending them through a funnel to actually get these ads to turn into paying clients. So those are my two offers. That's what I do all day, every day. I'm just talking about ads. I don't know why, but I could do it for the rest of my life. I'm super nerdy like that. Things do change enough to kind of keep me on my toes. But then I also have this podcast, which doesn't have very much to do with ads. And so I do want to kick this off by saying I don't recommend that somebody start a podcast that isn't related to the thing they're selling.
Right.
If it's a business podcast. If it's just for fun, that's fine. But I kind of went in a different direction and I'm happy with where it is now, but it wasn't a very savvy move strategically.
Okay, well, that's interesting. I mean, in general, I agree with you. I think that's good advice for people who are considering to start a podcast. But can you take us back to when you started a podcast and when did you start it and what was that first phase of, launching it like?
Yeah, great question because it's a long time ago. So I started my business at the very beginning of 2014. I was in a full-time job, but I kind of knew, once I discovered this world of online business and coaches and consulting, that I wanted to work for myself. And then I got fired, very surprisingly. I had this really great performance review, fabulous performance review, and a month later I got fired.
Wow.
And well, the company was kind of restructuring. My boss made the right decision. I am still, on great terms with her. I totally understand it, but I was in shock and I was really desperate. I was getting married that year. I didn't have any, income stream. So I started looking for clients. And what I noticed is there were no blog posts, pretty much back in 2014, everyone was creating blog posts, maybe some YouTube. There was no content out there that said how to get clients, step 1, step 2, nothing. And I kept thinking, okay, one day I would like to create this podcast called the Pay Your Rent podcast. Just what you need to do in order to pay your rent. And about a year later, when I finally decided to start the podcast, I decided to avoid this question of rent because what could that mean maybe in the real estate industry? I didn't want to confuse people. So I called it the Get Paid podcast. Just things that you need to know in order to get paid. And what I did is because I was seeing, actually it was funny, I was seeing ads all the time about, getting to 6 figures. But I had no idea what kind of business model somebody needed. Like, how many people did they need in their audience? What did they have to sell? And at what price did they have to sell it for? How many times a year? All those questions in order to reach six figures. So I decided to start this podcast to literally ask people how they were making money. What were they selling? What were they charging? How were they marketing it? How were they delivering it? And it was purely for selfish reasons because I was a baby business owner and I just wanted to know like the behind the scenes of these businesses. And it felt like nobody ever talked about that. So that's what I did. And now I interview business owners and I ask them, how much money do you make? How do you do it? What are your offers? How are you selling it? What is the hard part? What are the lessons learned? How are your launches doing these days? And a couple of years ago, I started asking people how much they pay themselves because it became abundantly clear that making $100,000 or 200 or 300 did not mean, and it took me a while to figure that out, but it didn't mean that they were paying themselves that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it sounds so good, but what, making a certain amount of money, what are we talking about? Are we revenue? Are we talking profit? Are we talking
They're
actual
never talking
income?
profit.
No. That's really interesting.
Yeah, in order to launch it, I just kind of went to my network. At that point, I'd had a couple clients who were really open about talking about money, or just like friends I had made in Facebook groups or in coaching programs. And I just said, like, this is my idea. These questions are going to be uncomfortable. They're not common, but this is what I want to put out in the world. And so I just got people, and it's funny because the show launched in 2015. It took a 3-year maternity leave after my first child. But I've been publishing episodes, I guess, like 7 years total. And people still come on and they say, I'm really nervous. Like they have been listening to the show for ages. They have either pitched me or I've invited them on. Everyone comes on and says, I'm really nervous to talk about this. Because usually when people go on a podcast, they're talking about their area of expertise.
Yeah.
Or like in your case, I'm just talking about my own podcasting experience and what I've learned and things like that. But it's unusual to put out into the world sort of your dirty laundry.
Yeah, it feels vulnerable for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. How do you handle that when someone comes on the show and they say, I'm really nervous? And in your case, it will be because of the topic and the questions that they know you will ask. But I think a lot of podcasters experience this. Maybe it's someone's first podcast interview, and people can be very, very nervous. I've had interviews with people where they were so nervous at first that I really had to, invest some time and effort into making them less nervous before hitting record. So how do you handle that?
So that's really interesting. I don't have a ton of experience with people who say they are nervous because they are kind of nervous speakers. We are really specific about who we invite onto the show. I must have listened to them on something before. So it's not usually like a question of experience. But when we are inviting people onto the show and we know that our subject matter is not comfortable for most people, we will say, this is what the show is about. Okay. Up front, there are no surprises. And if you are pitching our show, there's a form and it says, these are the types of questions, and check, click the box next to it if you're uncomfortable talking about it. And then, so they really do know ahead of time. There's preparation ahead of time. And then like when we start recording, I do my whole spiel just about like how we record, similar to what you explained to me at the top of this show. And I say, is there anything that's completely off limits? And most people will say no, but sometimes, yesterday or the other day, I had a financial person talking and there was just some personal finances, not even like her own, but with family members that she just didn't want to get into. And I understood why, like for safety reasons.
Yeah.
So we have no problem with that. I think the key is preparing people And we don't say these are all the questions that we're going to ask. Absolutely not. It's usually these are the types of questions that we ask.
Right.
Also, just I think being a good interviewer is really key. And that's on, that's not really something that you can necessarily expect the guest to have any say in. It's like, how are you going to be able to pivot the conversation if you're just not getting the story or you're not getting a comfortable, like somebody's just clearly uncomfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I think that also comes with time, right? Becoming a good interviewer. I also think when you're now starting your podcast and you think, well, okay, it comes with time, that's not very helpful for me at the moment. Then I think, to start, if you're calm and confident, like you said, if you're a confident interviewer, that already helps. But also if you're calm and just, to be honest, sometimes I let people talk a little bit, either before I hit record or even when I hit record. And then I actually think, you know what, we'll likely cut this part, but it's really just to let the guest, get it out and then get more comfortable so that we can still have really good content and the guest feels more comfortable that way by just giving them a little bit more time. I think that's my advice.
That makes so much sense. Another thing I say to people is we edit.
Yeah.
So if you feel like you mess up and you need to start back over, or you feel like you have overshared, because I definitely get emails from guests after the fact, like, can we cut this one piece out? And because, like I have told them, we edit and it's fine to not feel perfect about every word you've said. I think that also sets people at ease. But I love that just, you knowing yourself that it's okay for there to be extra things that don't necessarily make it on the show, and you're willing to spend the time, either you yourself or instructing an editor, what to take out.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's also actually a good point. That's super helpful. So you've been podcasting for so many years, I think 7 years of releasing episodes you mentioned. What changed since when you launched the podcast versus now?
Oh, that is a really great question. What has changed? Well, I would say there are some things that have just changed about me as an interviewer. My first 50 episodes, because that's exactly where the mark was of, we wrapped up because I was pregnant and whatnot. I was thinking a lot about what the guest would think. No, not so much the guest, more like what the listeners were thinking. Like, is this topic interesting? And of course, to a certain degree, you have to do that. But I remember coming back, it was, I think, the second interview after I came back from maternity leave. And I'm asking my guest, who is also somebody who I happen to work with, like we had a client in common, and she lived abroad. And I was asking her about like her dating life as a single mom, like basically the logistics of getting a sitter in a country where you don't know. And I'm thinking the whole time, I'm thinking, oh my God, what if people hate this topic? Like it's not business related. And it was an unpleasant recording experience. And after that episode recording, I said to myself, I can no longer obsess over whether or not the listeners are going to like every moment of this show. If I want to have a conversation about dating abroad as a single mom, that's what's going to keep this podcast going, is me enjoying the conversations. So a little bit of that like audience people pleasing and worrying about that is now 100% gone. And I think I have become more me, which is extremely nosy. I bring up a whole lot of stuff that's not necessarily business related, and it's part of what makes my show different. Because I remember hearing this from someone that when I was launching, that when someone listens to your podcast, this is a little bit of like scarcity mindset, but I think it's true. When someone listens to your podcast, you're actually taking them away from listening to another podcast because of the time, right? We all have finite time. If you are somebody who commutes and you're listening to podcasts on your commute, you're not going to double your commute to double the number of shows you listen to.
Yeah.
So I think like just leaning into who I am as a person, that has changed over time. In terms of like the landscape of podcasting, I can't really say. Do you think that it's changed a lot?
I think so. I mean, I have not worked in podcasting for those entire, well, actually 10 years since you started your show, right? Because you mentioned in 2014 you started working on the launch. So I know that 10 years ago it looked very different in the sense that there were not that many podcasts. I know from people who were podcasting back then that a lot of people didn't really know what they were doing, and now there are more best practices that are well known because, you know, people tried stuff and there's just more shows.
So, what do you think some of the best practices are? Because, and this also happens whenever I go on a show, I end up interviewing the interviewer. It's just what I do.
I mean, it's
Because
my
when,
risk because I get podcasters on my show, you know, so I
yes, of
accept that
course.
risk.
So, like, there were best practices for launching a podcast. And
Right.
I wonder if it was easier back in the day to get on like new and noteworthy simply because there were fewer podcasts. But in terms of best practices as a podcaster now, like, for example, you have very short episodes. My episodes go from 90 minutes to 2 hours. And I don't think either of those is a best practice. You know, what do you think some of the best practices are?
There are best practices, but, you know, I like to not listen to them and, you know, not follow the rules. But I do tell my clients about this, that when you launch a business podcast, it's good to know that overall, most podcasts, especially most educational or business podcasts, they're between 20 and 40 minutes long. So that's a best practice. Not saying you have to do it, but I think it's interesting to know that, you know, of all the shows out there, most are kind of between that, between 20 and 40 minutes. So that's the best practice, but also release schedule. I think after testing and, you know, seeing so many shows either succeed or not succeed, and whatever that looks like also, right? Like what are the results that we're tracking, what's important. But weekly is the best practice to stay top of mind and not overwhelm your audience. And again, there's so many exceptions, right? If you have a 5-minute daily podcast, for example, yeah, that can also work really, really well. But in general, right, especially for business podcasts, weekly works well for most podcasters. So that's also a best practice that I usually bring up and tell my clients about. Yeah, I mean, there's some other things about also format, you know, what should you be talking about? What should be in an intro? What should not be in an intro? What should be in an outro? So yeah, that kind of stuff as well.
You know, this is for anyone who's listening, who's thinking about, like, I'm not sure if I can get to a weekly schedule. We did weekly very religiously for a while. And then over the years, as my life has changed, the business has changed, we often slip into every other week. And I am back at weekly now. Like, it's what I want, but I know that something is better than nothing. Now, my podcast has like years of antiquity, right? That's not the word that I'm looking for. But just like, it's, my listeners have been, many of them have been listening for a very long time, and they wonder, where are the episodes? Because they've told me, but they're like forgiving of that. I do agree that upon launching, having like a good 8 to 12 weeks of consistent episodes is a great idea. And if you can't keep up the consistency, it doesn't mean that you have to shut down the podcast.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I think if you want to be consistent, but you're worried about that part, make sure you're prepared before launching your podcast. So have some episodes recorded in the bank, even if they're not produced yet, but if they're recorded, that's already huge.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, if you have to change to every other week, that's totally fine. And it also depends on what the goal is for your podcast. Because if your podcast is all about growing an audience or reaching new people, and you're really focused on building trust with these people, yes, consistency is important. Because that is one of the things that builds trust, and especially in a podcast landscape where a lot of podcasters pod fade, right? They just don't really announce it, but they just never release new episodes anymore after a while. That's very common, and that does not build trust with an audience. That might even hurt your brand if you're a business. So
That's very true.
yeah, so I think being intentional about that and announcing like, hey, we're going to every other week if you can, right? Maybe you can just make that a thing, like for the summer months, we're going to every other week. You can play with that, but knowing that, you know, you are, you can be building trust with a new audience if you want that to be the goal. If you already have that audience and you're really looking to show them more of your brand, your personality, warm up your audience to maybe potentially become a client, but they're already there and they know you and they already have a lot of trust. Or like you said, you have so much content and people know that even though there's no episode this week, you'll be back because
Right.
you've always been back. I think that
And
is
I
such
do keep
a
coming
different
back. Yeah.
case. Yeah, exactly. And people see that. And I think that makes it a completely different case. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of, there's best practices, but then there's so many exceptions and special cases. And yeah, the fun part for sure for about podcasting for me.
Yeah. And I think like having, like you said, people know that that I'm gonna come back. But there's also something about like the creativity that having a long running podcast gives you. So even if like you are struggling to, for example, I'm pregnant now. I'm gonna be having my third. And what I did for my second was I banked a lot of interviews, a lot. But what we're finding is it's the summer. People are, they're all like, can we record in the fall? Can we record in the fall? And it's like,
No.
no, not
Yeah.
really. So what's the like troubleshooting there is my idea is I'm going to reach out to probably 12, like my goal is to have 12 episodes of guests, people who have been on the show before, and literally ask them, what solo episode from your show would you be willing to let me publish? Like, I am always listening to other people's shows and thinking, that is so brilliant. I'll go and post on social media about it. But like, two people might go and listen to the episode. And like, I actually think that the teaching part can happen with somebody else's episode just on your show. This is something that I also do with some of my guests. If somebody invites me onto their show and the topic is like really, really deep or really juicy, I'll say, can we also publish this on my show?
Yeah.
So there are also ways to kind of, when things feel hard, if you're an interview show, as I'm sure you know, Anne, like you do a combination, right, of solo and interviews, but it can be hard to
Yeah.
constantly get guests. So there are ways to have like a bit of a hybrid or, yeah, republish old episodes or have some guest hosts, if you will.
Yeah, that's actually a good point because for my other podcast, I do have a guest host, a co host who just came on, I think, about a year and a half ago, where I couldn't find the time to do all these interviews. So instead of not releasing weekly, I thought, okay, how can I make this easier for myself? How can I make sure that the podcast keeps going, but also that it doesn't cost me too much time? And then I asked a co-host, and it has been great because she knows different people. So she interviews different people, and then her interview style is also slightly different. I think it matches well. That's my personal opinion. But it is different. Like she just asks different questions in a different way. And I think that for honestly many interview shows, that's really interesting for a listener.
Yeah.
Like it's
No,
just a
you're
different
absolutely right. I
perspective.
love that idea. That didn't occur to me to literally have like the same interviewer, but so that it's still the type of questions that we ask or maybe a little bit different. Yeah, didn't think of that. See, this is the brilliance of having other podcasters to chat with.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay, I want to ask you one more question, Claire, because I know that, I want to be mindful of your time and of our listeners' time, but I was really wondering, you mentioned that you wouldn't recommend someone to start a podcast that is not directly related to the thing that they're selling in their business. But I'm wondering, how has the podcast been for your business? Has it had a positive effect, or would you say not at all, or maybe not optimal, but there was something that, that cross promotes? Or can you share a little bit more about that? Because I think that's super interesting.
Oh, absolutely. So on the whole, my podcast, the investment in time and in money for editing, for the team, for everything has paid back so many times because my clients, especially high ticket clients, more than 50% of them are diehard listeners. Not I've listened a couple times, diehard. And I know because we give them a couple different options in their intake form to say like what kind of listener have they ever listened, things like that. So that's one. And I think that's just sort of a branding thing. The podcast allows me to show my personality. It always allows me to show my values simply because of the questions that I ask. And I definitely made a shift. I couldn't tell you when. Maybe 2019 was like where I really started getting more serious about putting out solo episodes about Facebook ads. And what's funny is if I look at the numbers, which I just kind of stopped doing, but if I look at the download numbers, every time I put out a solo episode, the downloads are like 60, maybe 70% of what it is when I have a guest on. And that is like a little knife in the heart, right? Like this is just me talking about my area of expertise, and you guys definitely are less into it, except all of my clients, all of the diehard listeners who have paid me money say your solo episodes are my favorite.
Quality over quantity.
Yeah, exactly. So I just have to kind of force myself to keep doing it. But we have figured out ways to really track exactly who's coming from the podcast. You know, if we're promoting a webinar, we'll have a unique URL that I'm only saying on the podcast so that we know, okay, these people are coming in from the podcast. I didn't always have that. It always kind of felt like a little bit of spaghetti at the wall and hope this is having an impact. But no, we've definitely seen a positive ROI, like a really big positive ROI. And it's what kind of keeps me going, because in the moments where it feels like it's hard to come up with something new, how do I keep it fresh? Or, you know, am I interviewing the same type? This is something that gets on my nerves, interviewing the people who have the same business model. So for a while I had like so many copywriters, and copywriters are great. They're very important. And there wasn't a lot of variation in their businesses so that my listeners could learn. So it's what does motivate me to keep going, to keep troubleshooting and keep finding different ways to keep the podcast going.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, I love hearing that. That's amazing. And
oh yeah,
that's so
all
cool.
my clients say the same thing about their podcasts too.
Yeah.
When they come in, they start working with us, I'm like, where are you getting your clients from? Oh, everyone says the podcast. So
it's what you said. It's an important trust builder, because people can hear you. They can hear your voice. They can hear how you teach. And even though those solo episodes, they're not reaching the masses maybe, but it's not about that download number. It's about who's listening. And then they apparently also have a really positive effect on your conversions, where people think after a while of listening, I need to get on a call. I need to talk to Claire about my Facebook ads. That's really cool.
Somebody who I have just kind of known on the internet for a long time DM'd me a month or so ago, and he said, I am absolutely in your next round of Get Paid Marketing, which is my group program, because every time I listen to you, I get new ideas.
Yeah.
So like, just imagine being related, like having somebody relate you with new, fresh ideas. It's
wow.
And I'm not doing anything except being me and getting to chat with cool people.
Yeah, exactly. That's a huge compliment. That's amazing.
Yeah, I thought so.
Claire, where can people find you on the internet and also your podcast?
Okay, well, the best thing is wherever you're listening to this podcast, just go into the search bar and search Get Paid Claire. That's going to be the easiest way to find the Get Paid podcast. Or if you do want to check out my site and kind of get all kinds of Facebook and Instagram ad trainings, free resources there, you can go to clairepells.com. I'm like a student of my own business where I don't really use social media because I run ads instead. So you can find me on Instagram at Claire Pells, but you're not going to see anything there. You're welcome to DM me though. I do chat with people if you have, questions about whether or not you should be running ads, or if you're curious about what our most downloaded podcast is and which one you should start with, I'm happy to answer that. So I'm at Claire Pells there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Claire. We'll also add those links to the show notes so you can find them there. Claire, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to talk with you about your podcast, and thank you for being so open, sharing everything about what worked, well, we didn't even touch on what didn't work, to be honest, but you had so much good advice, and yeah, thank you so much for sharing.
It's my pleasure. This was such a great way to kick off my day. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you. All right, and thank you for listening, Podcast Babes. Until the next episode. All right, that's it for today's episode. Need some help to get your podcast off the ground? Not sure where to start and what to focus on? Go to thepodcastbabes.com to schedule a call and learn more about our podcast launch and production services. See you next week.